for joining us today. This is a joint seminar between SHLC and SUEUAA, and we'll be talking today about an introduction to creative research methods. So thank you again for joining us. If you have any questions as you go on, please include them in the chat room beside, and there'll be opportunities for us to answer your questions as we go on. So just to introduce ourselves. Sorry, we have a little bit of a technical difficulty here with the slides not working on our computer, but of course it's technology. So would you like to introduce yourself while we're... So just to introduce myself, my name is Dr Joanne Neary. I work in the School of Education and in the Department of General Practice and Primary Care. I'm a medical sociologist with an interest in how social policy influences health and well-being in people's everyday lives.
Sorry about that, everyone. So to introduce myself, my name's Carli Rowell and I'm a research fellow here in the School of Social and Political Sciences, working within SHLC. I would describe myself as a sociologist, a feminist and an ethnographer, particularly interested in educational inequalities and as they intersect with various other factors. My PhD was in ethnography of working class students at an elite university, and a lot of the methods that I'll be talking about later on in this session, I'll be drawing upon some examples from my PhD.
So just to give you an overview of what we're talking about today, we'll be introducing in brief the broad theory that underpins and the practice of creative research methods. We'll be providing examples of some creative research methods you can use in your own practice, and can give you an opportunity to think through if these research methods are suitable or can be applied to your research. However, we should point out that many of the examples are drawn from our own research and our PhDs conducted in the global north, and examples of creative methods will be provided, but we won't be providing a comprehensive overview, but can provide references that you can read up in your own time. And we'll also be touching on some of the issues of creative research methods, but we won't be providing a definitive account. This field is growing fast and changing all the time, and it's a very interesting field to be part of, and a conversation is always evolving. So we'll be answering the following questions during this 2-hour seminar. How are creative methods informed by a wider participatory research method paradigm? How are they influenced by community engagement approaches? And how do creative methods focus on empowerment and emancipation of research participants? We'll be focusing on 3 research methods: photo elicitation, walking interviews, which are also called go-alongs in the literature, and mapping. We will finish off the session talking about ethics and analysis in creative methods, and as I've said previously, we'll also be providing opportunities for you all to ask questions and for us to either answer them fully or maybe direct you to other places where you can get information. Okay, and hopefully this sounds like a nice 2-hour session, because we've had a lot of fun designing it. So when we talk about creative methods, we look at methods that draw on inventive, imaginative processes, serving as tools through which participants can describe their lives. These often involve art-based approaches like visual methods or performance, and can also be mixed with other methods, both other creative methods and traditional methods like focus groups, surveys, or other interviews. They can also be seen to be participatory and informed by community-based approaches, which we'll be talking about later on today. They're often based within qualitative research methods, but not always. There are examples of people who have used creative methods with quantitative approaches. Creative methods enable a different approach to explore the world around us that go beyond the boundaries of traditional methods, and can offer a different perspective and challenge disciplinary practice. A quote by Dunn and Mellor in 2017 say that some knowings might not be accessed by mainstream methods that rely on people's verbal or written competences. Creative methods, often by using arts-based approaches, can look at people's unspoken knowledges or their behaviours or their ways of emoting in a way that maybe they wouldn't be able to verbalise correctly in terms of how an academic may view knowledge. It can also be seen to challenge the everyday activities or unspoken knowledge of participants. So being able to go beyond someone saying, my day is normal, there's nothing really to speak about, but actually getting them to photograph it or getting them to provide a glimpse into the routine through walking may actually allow the researcher to look more ethnographically at what normal is for them. However, when we talk about creative methods, we also talk about the importance of fit. A piece by Cara in 2016 says the methods must flow from the research question and should be those most likely to provide an answer. So while newly learned methods may be very tempting to try out, it's never good practice to be seduced by an attractive young method when an older, more familiar one would serve you better. So what we have to ask ourselves as researchers is, what value is going to be added for us to utilise these creative methods? Is there actually a good fit between the research question we want to ask and the method we want to use to collect that data? It might be a nice idea to use it, but actually, is it going to provide any use to us to answer our questions and to fulfil the kind of funding briefs? So before I pass on to Carli, the last point of this part is that creative methods are often discussed within the paradigm of participatory or emancipatory research, which Carli will now go on to talk about.
Thank you, Jo. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking through what we mean when we talk of participatory research. And this is because, as Jo's just alluded to, a lot of the creative methods are born out of this participatory research relationship. When I'm talking about participatory research, I'm going to draw heavily from the work of Melanie Nines, who has summarised lots of these points in a really nice video. I'm not going to play the video for the purpose of this session, but the link is included on the final slides for those of you that wanted to watch the video at length in your own time. So to begin with, participatory research is developed as a way of doing research largely for people who have been considered voiceless or powerless. So here we're trying to kind of include the perspectives, experiences, opinions, sentiments of those who have historically and in the contemporary times are considered voiceless or powerless. It's about trying to enable people to participate more. So in that vein, it's this idea of having more hierarchical power relationships in the research process itself. So when we think about the researcher and research relationship, traditionally methods might be directed by the researcher and the research just simply respond to. But here in the participatory research methods, there's a lot of co-collaboration, maybe in the research design, but definitely in data collection. So in this vein, there's often a blurring of the division between the researcher and the researched. Again, kind of trying to make more hierarchical, non-hierarchical and more equal research relationships in the field and so on. So just to talk you through some of the principles of participatory research methods, at the very heart, participatory research methods are trying to enable to participate more in research rather than researchers simply extracting data from them. And this is really important to consider when thinking about participatory research methods. It really, really values subjective experience. So when we're interested in really understanding individual stories and experiences, and that is at the heart of participatory research methods. And I've just included this quote at the bottom of the slide because I think it really summarises really well what participatory research methods are based on. So Melanie Nine talks about, for years and years, people with learning disabilities have been researched. People have done things to them, on them, prodded them, poked them, talked with professionals about them, talked with families about them, but very rarely have spoken directly to them. And they're not really regarded as holders of valid knowledge in their own right. And that last few words, holders of valid knowledge in their own right, is really kind of the founding principles of participatory research methods. So it's kind of understanding that participants knowledge comes from participants, and that knowledge is considered as valid, and so on. So participatory research methods are based on the principles of participation and self-development. It treats people as research participants rather than research subjects, and that shift in language is really, really important. It's this idea that the individuals taking part in the research are participating rather than kind of just being passive within the research process. Participatory research methods are always people-centred, in the sense that the processes of critical inquiry is informed by and responds to the experiences and needs of people involved. And I think that's really important, that the methods that we used aren't simply because that sounds nice, that sounds fun, that's interesting, but it's actually the correct method in order to respond to the experiences and the needs of the people involved. And it's the right method to use to capture the experiences and the needs of the people that are involved. The fundamental principle of participatory research is that it is research with rather than on people. And again, I've mentioned that in the previous slide, but I think that's a point well worth mentioning over and over again. So in this vein, it emphasises knowledge for action and a bottom-up approach, in contrast to more conventional research that has historically been more top-down. So it's kind of flipping this idea of researchers and academics in the ivory tower, extracting knowledge from a top-down position, and actually saying, okay, as a group of individuals, or indeed as an individual, I, as the researcher, I'm going to understand what you have to say, and you tell me how we can go about this, and so on. So in that vein, it's inviting people to participate in the co-creation of knowledge about themselves. And this can be thinking about the best way of researching a topic. So participatory research methods might involve involving participants in the actual research design. It might involve participants crafting the overarching research questions. It might actually also include participants in the collection and generation of research data in a very collaborative way, and indeed thinking about creative ways of representing your research and disseminating your research and writing it up. Increasingly, sometimes participants are involved in actually analysing the data and writing up the data, as well as disseminating it. But that raises a whole host of ethical questions, which for the purpose of this session, we won't get into, but are interesting to think about nonetheless. So, some of these themes may have come through in me talking around the previous slides, but just to kind of really put centre stage that participatory research methods have at their heart these themes and issues around power, empowerment, and being emancipatory. However, there are caveats to this idea that all participatory research methods all the time empower respondents and so on. It's too simplistic to assume that an approach that includes the respondents at all levels is ultimately empowering for respondents. And what we mean by this is it's not enough to say, well, the participants have been included in the design, in the collection, and maybe even in the dissemination, therefore that's fine, it's not exploitative, you know, it's really empowering. That's not always the case. And we need to remember that as researchers, we have the objective balance of power throughout the research process, albeit that that power is ambivalent and that power relations will shift and change over time and go backwards and forth. So one example of this may be, for those of you that have conducted interviews, that strange experience of 1 minute you may be in control of the interview and then your participant may be steering the direction of the interview. But then as the researcher, as the interviewer, we always have the power to kind of bring it back to, you know, what is it that we're asking? So that's just to give you an example from a more conventional research method. So Stanley and Wise, written heavily on the idea of power, empowerment in research, and spoke about this idea that we should always try and make ourselves vulnerable and try to equalise our relationship with respondents. So it's kind of this idea that It's okay to not always feel in control when you're doing research, particularly as within the social sciences, we do research out in the real world, not in a lab. We can't control everything. So that's absolutely fine. And sometimes we may feel vulnerable. Maybe a participant asks us a question about ourselves, and whether or not you respond to that, that's up to you as a researcher. And again, just to remind you that the research relationship is fluid, changing, and is always jointly constructed. So it's just as it's too simplistic to say the researcher is always in control, it's also too simplistic to say that the participants are in control. It's always shifting. And I think that we need to be mindful of that and reflect on that at every stage of the research, from the initial kind of crafting of our research question in the field and when we're disseminating. So making people feel powerful, importantly, does not necessarily change their objective material circumstances. And I think this is really important when we're doing participatory research methods, particularly when we're engaging with research questions concerned with issues of social justice, and whether that's to do with education, gender, commodity chains, employment, etc. And just because somebody comes away from an interview feeling really empowered, they may have shared a really insightful story about something, you know, and they may feel in control and think, okay, I'm going to make changes, I'm going to do something different. That's great, but we need to remember that just because they feel that way internally, it doesn't change the existing structures in which they exist in. So often their objective material circumstances unfortunately don't change because they've taken part in participatory research, and that because they've felt empowered by that. Change can happen, and it's important that we work towards change, but it's not enough to say, well, great, that person feels empowered, I've done my bit for the world. We need to recognise the external structures and reflect on that as well throughout our research design. So and in this same vein, right, respondents might not need to feel empowered, and it's important that the research methods that you use don't over-pacify respondents. And I think that creative and participatory research methods do this really nicely by engaging and encouraging the engagement of research participants throughout the research process, particularly within the field, because you're placing the respondents, the participants, as the experts. They are the experts, and you as the researcher are here to listen and learn from them. So that's a really nice way to think about, you know, the importance of not over-pacifying respondents. And importantly, Beverly Skeggs has spoken about the way in which, at the end of the day, researchers take away words, not experiences. And when we think about participatory research methods, creative research methods, what we get in the field is essentially a representation. We can't extract that whole embodied experience, although we may try to in terms of the methods that we use, whether it's visual or through video, etc., and pictures or videos and recordings. At the end of the day, we do take away words. So that raises important questions when we think about doing creative research, participatory research in the field. Well, what does that mean when it comes to writing up and disseminating our research? Who has the power there? So we've spoken about in the field, power may shift between the researcher and participants, but actually who comes away and sits in front of the computer and writes up the words and maybe submits a journal article or a policy briefing or whatever kind of dissemination method that may be. And importantly, who will benefit from the research? These are really important questions that we need to think about throughout our research process. So just to give you some examples of participatory research methods that have used creative methods, some of which I'll be discussing later on and some of which we just unfortunately won't have time for. Photo elicitation, walk-in and go-along interviews, driving tours and mapping. Me and Jo will be speaking about those in the second part of this session. But also video diaries, photo diaries, diaries per se, and reflective essay writing, which reflective essay writing is a really nice tool. So I do encourage you to have a little read about that in your own time. Okay, I'm going to pass back over to Jo now.
So maybe we've decided that creative methods and a participatory approach is useful for your work in communities. But we also have questions like, what is your community? Are you looking at a neighbourhood, a city? Are you looking at a community that's already predefined and can self-define themselves as a community of people? Or are you, as the researcher, going to artificially create a community for the purposes of your research? So in answer to the question, what is a community? The answer is, it's dependent on the nature of your research and the goal of your engagement activity. And often in the context of being a researcher and having to apply for funding to do research, often we define community, and we may be able to tap into those who self-define as a community, but often we have to select and recruit people for the purposes of research. However, it is more than a target population for the study and often includes wider populations that, while they may not be participating as participants in the study, they will also be impacted by the results and suggestions that you may have. So community engagement in research settings often seek to identify and clarify issues affecting our community as told by the community themselves. The community therefore can shape the research agenda through input and discussions with the researchers and with other stakeholders. The collaborative approach for a common goal involves the community in all or some aspects of the research, involves building capacity and empowerment, knowledge transfer and exchange, and providing meaningful research activities. In community engagement, often these activities are not seen as just one-offs. They are a kind of constant dialogue where both the researcher and the community can learn from one another. So by the end of the process, both sides should feel like they have gained something from this experience. So in terms of how creative methods speak to some of these issues, we would argue that by identifying and clarifying issues affecting the community as told by the community themselves, developing empowerment and providing meaningful research activities, these are things that creative research methods themselves can improve the quality of your engagement activities. And this is a quote from the World Social Science Report. There are key opportunities for a transformative knowledge agenda that's co-constructed with those who are experiencing inequalities and are in a position to influence change through policies, practices and politics. In a world in which knowledge shapes power and voice, and vice versa, the fundamental inequality in the production of knowledge about inequality itself must be addressed, which again is something that we believe creative methods, participatory research and community engagement approaches can do in order to shape the conversations we are having about inequality, to kind of shine a light on everyday experiences and those knowledges that maybe are not being promoted in dialogue. However, there are also, again, things to consider when looking at these things. So a question we have to ask ourselves are, what are the strengths and weaknesses of using creative methods linked with a community engagement approach? This includes from a community point of view and also from an academic point of view. One thing that we would say is that there will be differences in demands of the community and that of the university. Are you conducting community engagement approaches in order to improve the quality of your research and to meet the funders' criteria, as often nowadays funders are asking for community engagement as one of your deliverables? Or is your aim to have direct, long-lasting benefits to the community? It could be both, but often one is driving more than the other. There's also issues of focusing an engagement into a workable time frame. While researchers may want to spend years in the fields and developing these long-lasting relationships, often the community engagement has to fit into the time frame of a study. There's also differences in context and differences in the population group that you want to work with. And also the question of how do we evaluate effectiveness? If it is a term of funders' agreement, how are we going to say, by using creative methods, by engaging with communities over a long period of time, we have developed X, Y, Z. And for academics, often this means benchmarking, often it means being able to show like vignettes of how your community engagement has improved matters in the communities, which is a challenge for everyone, but especially those who want to do the kind of less traditional methods. How does using photography, how does using diaries, how did that have an impact, and how can you show that?
Okay, so I'm going to move on to speak about methods, but just before I do, we've just got some of the questions that have been coming in. So I'm going to take a minute to pause and to answer some of them, and later on I'll answer some more. So I've got a question from Vanessa at the University of Greenwich who is asking, can we provide an example of creative methods mixed with quantitative methods? I'm going to pause you on that question because Joe later on in this session is going to talk you through some mixed creative methods, but that's really great that that question's come in. It shows that we're on the right lines. We're on the same wave as you, so brilliant. We've got some questions about ethics, which again we're going to come on to later on. We've got a really interesting point with regards to the quote that I put up from Bev Steggs that says, researchers take away words, not experiences. And the question says, but I found that people spoke based on their experiences. Is it right to analyse the experiences? So definitely 100%. I think what I meant when I made that point in terms of researchers take away words, not experiences, is that we are taking away the verbal and sometimes visual representation of somebody's experience of an issue. As a researcher, we have 9 times out of 10, we don't share that same experience. So I think it's less about the fact that our research doesn't concern experience, but more about that, you know, we're taking away a representation of that experience rather than having the full experience in itself. Joe, do you have any comment on that?
I think to add to that, I think sometimes it's a risk that we don't provide context within which we're giving the stories. So often you may give a quote but not be able to provide the context in which that story has been said, especially if we're looking at kind of maybe more disempowered groups or disenfranchised groups. Like, it's important that we're able to see the participant is telling this story, but when we're looking at the kind of wider like macro level, neighbourhood level, policy level conditions in which they're living, this is why their worldview is shaped like that. And I think that's something that the kind of sociological literature is keen to address.
Definitely. We've also got a question about whether the topic of creative and participatory research methods can be implemented, embedded in the method of surveys in order to identify issues which could then be investigated, various forms of creative approaches. So I think what I'm getting from this question is, can we use surveys to identify issues which could then be investigated using various creative approaches? Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I think the best thing about a mixed method approach is, while a kind of quantitative approach can give like outcomes or can give areas to focus on, a qualitative approach can give the kind of, it can shine a light more on the processes within which these decisions are put on. So if someone in a survey says, my neighbourhood is a problem, it feels unsafe, a creative approach may be able to ask people, can you take photographs of things that make you feel unsafe? Can you, at a time that's safe for you, can you maybe write a map where you're showing safe and unsafe places? So in that way, the creative methods can then inform the reasons behind which someone is saying somewhere is unsafe. So that's a nice way for the kind of mixing of methods to work well there.
Definitely. Okay, thank you for the questions. We're going to pick up some questions after this next session. So as Joe and I talk through some of the methods, if you've got any questions that's coming to your mind, do pop those down, and we are going to try and answer as many questions as possible. So thank you. So I'm going to begin by talking through the method of photo elicitation, and I'm going to speak for quite a little bit of time regarding the theory of photo elicitation in terms of, what is the purpose, what are the benefits, and then I will talk about some of the applications of photo elicitation, primarily drawing upon my experience from my PhD, but I'll also give you some examples from beyond my own research. So as I kind of elucidate what photo elicitation is, I'll be drawing on some of the key authors within the area. So to begin with, I'm going to read out this quote from Harper, who has written prominently on the topic of photo elicitation. Simply put, photo elicitation is based on the simple idea of inserting a photograph into the traditional and conventional research interview. The photo elicitation interview seems like not simply an interview process that elicits more information, but rather one that evokes a different kind of information. So here, the method of inserting photos into an interview, it's not to generate more information, but it's to kind of generate a different type of information. And I'll speak a little bit more about what that different kind of information will be. Photos serve as a visual starting point for discussion. It's a sensory experience in the sense that when we look at a photo, we often bring our own interpretations and connotations and emotions to that photo. And in that way, this is how, on one level, we're eliciting and evoking a different kind of information via the use of photographs. But it's important to remember that not all photographs are good for photo elicitation. Importantly, there needs to be a personal relationship between the participant and the photograph. And similarly, photos that are not interesting have shown to not elicit rich information. So, on some levels, the photos do need to be interesting. And also, photos that are obvious. I've put this in here, but I'm kind of on the fence with this because at times photos that are obvious might not elicit interesting information, but actually what seems so obvious in a photo might not actually be the reason why the photo has been taken or what the photo is getting at from the respondent's point of view. So sometimes obvious photos actually capture a lot of really interesting information and data. So when we think about photo elicitation interviews, why bother? Why do them? Why deviate from the conventional verbal interview? What is the point of adding this extra layer of inserting these photos into the interviews? Well, photo elicitation has been shown that has been foregrounded for its ability to prod latent memory, to stimulate and release emotional statements about the informant's life, and to reach a deeper centre of reaction, triggering spontaneous revelations of a highly charged emotional nature. So earlier in the previous slide, I was talking about photo elicitation has the ability to elicit a different type of information. Well, this is what I was getting at. Photo elicitation, prod memory, release emotional statements, and a deeper reaction, often triggering spontaneous revelations of a highly charged emotional nature. And with that comes a lot of ethical considerations, which I'll talk about in a second. But a second point when we think about why photo elicitation is that the photographic record can supply detail that would only otherwise be accessible or obtained from the researcher or by the researcher only by lengthy first-hand experience. So, for example, if I wanted to know what it was like to grow up as a young female in a impoverished area of South London, and I didn't have the time to live there myself, or I didn't find that it was ethical for me to insert myself into a community, how might I be able to understand what it's like to live within an impoverished area, neighbourhood, for example? Well, one way around that is that I might ask my participants to take photographs that document their experiences of living within that community. And that's one way of centering information, data that otherwise would only be gained through lengthy first-hand experience. So if you are time poor and you don't have the resources, or perhaps it's not ethically sensible for you to go into a particular neighbourhood or community or whatever your research setting may be. Another example would be, there's a study using photo elicitation of cancer patients on a hospital ward. Not suitable for the research to be present all the time. So again, photo elicitation was used to document cancer patients' experiences of life on a hospital ward. So yeah, a great method to gain access and insight into an experience that researchers won't have access to for ethical, practical, or temporal reasons. What is interesting about photo elicitation, and this comes back to my earlier point when I raised this question of, you know, photos that seem ordinary, are they interesting, are they not, is that photo elicitation does capture the ordinary. However, it turns the ordinary on its head. So given that we are often so familiar with the space and places that we inhabit, reflecting back on our familiar locations may often be marked by disasters and breathtaking circumstances. So it's this idea that when somebody asks you, I don't know, reflect back on your time at university, you know, that experience perhaps became very ordinary, going to lectures, writing assignments, going to the library, or perhaps not going to the library. And when we reflect back, it's often only those dramatic events that we kind of remember. The ordinary stuff we kind of gloss over. So what was your holiday like? Oh, it was great, we did this, we did that. The ordinary stuff we kind of tend not to foreground or remember. So Collier, another writer on the topic of photo elicitation, argues that environmental circumstances may have left the informant so starved for verbal expression. So this is about doing research with regards to people's environment and their life world and their experiences. So it's this idea that things in life tend to become ordinary pretty quickly. So sometimes we find it hard to articulate and verbalise our ordinary experiences. So by using photo elicitation, the ordinary everyday experiences are captured, but actually we're invited to question them. And again, participant-driven photo elicitation can facilitate access to researchers' unknown unknowns. The unknown unknowns are simply those instances and things that we don't know, that we don't know. So let's just think about a one-on-one interview or maybe a focus group. As researchers, we go into with predefined questions, albeit we're free to kind of deviate from those questions and go with the flow. But actually, we only know so much, and if we're researching an issue or a community, there's perhaps lots and lots of factors and issues that we don't even know exist. And actually, by using photo elicitation, again, we're placing power arguably into the respondents' hands, and those respondents can perhaps cast light on some of those unknown unknowns in relation to capturing what appears to be on the surface quite ordinary, but actually when you dig into it can be really, really interesting. And similarly, thinking about the ordinary and perhaps what is familiar and everyday. Photo elicitation makes the familiar strange. So it encourages us to slow down and deconstruct our perceptions by ensuring that we linger and notice which we may not otherwise miss. So it's this idea that when we look at a photo, we're really taking the time to think about, okay, why did I take that? In that moment, why was it important to take that photo? What was I trying to convey? What was I trying to show? What am I trying to tell the researcher? And often in photo elicitation interviews that I've conducted, and I'm not sure if you've found this as well, Jo, sometimes participants will be like, I can't get out what I'm trying to say here. And they have trouble trying to find the words that convey what it is they've captured in the photo. And sometimes, you know, it does take a little while to just kind of look and just wait and pause and have that silence, and that silence is fine. And then the words that participants draw upon and kind of piece together a sentence that is trying to convey what's in the picture. And I think that is really rich, because it just shows the value of photo elicitation for conveying instances and experiences that, you know, sometimes we just can't verbally articulate. So images also have the propensity to portray what otherwise would remain hidden. So we may have access to backstage instances and routines that are seldom accessed in conventional interviewing. So one example of this would be in my PhD, I interviewed working class students at an elite university, and a lot of our discussions were about on their experiences of being a student at this elite university as it related to on campus. Their on-campus experiences and how they moved around the campus and experienced lectures and student social life. But I was also really interested in exploring their experiences of being at university when they were among their home communities that hadn't taken this route through education. And there was only so much that I would get through interviews with my participants with regards to kind of probing into the life worlds at home in their communities, and it wasn't until I did photo elicitation interviews that actually they brought their reflections around being at home and being in their home community, and spoke about that. So I asked participants to take photos of their experience of being a working class student at an elite university, and what that meant and how that they lived that experience when they were at home. So they took pictures, and that was really, really a nice way to kind of get access to this backstage, if you will, element of what it means to be a working class student at an elite university. Yeah, and again, I've kind of alluded to this. So in terms of photo elicitation and making the familiar strange, it encourages participants to show rather than tell aspects of their identity or their experience that otherwise might have remained hidden. So again, picking up on this theme of empowerment in creative and participatory research methods, photo elicitation highlights participants' voices and perceptions. Brilliant, great. But it's also important to remember who is responsible for taking the photographs and who is interpreting them. And there's no right or wrong answer. But when you think about who is responsible for taking the photographs, is it the researcher, the respondent, or both working together in collaboration? And importantly, this question of interpretation, I think, is really, really important. So if you have participants that have taken photographs of their experience of living in a low-income area of South London, and they give them to you, and you do a photo elicitation interview, are you going to focus on the verbal articulations and explanations of the photograph, i.e. are you going to focus your analysis on what the participant has told you about the photograph, or are you also going to interpret what's in the photograph themselves? And I think this is where the question of empowerment comes in terms of whose voice are you highlighting? Are you going to foreground your participants' voices, or are you going to also deconstruct and analyse the photo and compare perhaps what's going on in the photo from your interpretation to that of the participants? When you're thinking about the instructions that you're going to give to participants when you're asking them to do photo elicitation, you know, there's no right or wrong question to ask. And again, this is where perhaps you can be creative in terms of the questions that you ask. But, you know, it's a nice idea to often invite participants to comment on why they took that photo as a starting point. You know, what is going on in that photo? Tell me about that photo. What does this photo mean? What are you showing? Just a nice, open, broad question. Because you don't want to go in with a question that's too closed and too focused, because you run the risk of kind of sidelining what the participant wanted to kind of get out. And also, just to pick up on something I mentioned earlier, provide space within your photo elicitation for your participants to really sit back and think, oh God, why did I take that photo? Because sometimes we might find that participants have taken a photo and they need time to think about what that means beyond the surface level as well. And that's really, really interesting, and that often makes for really interesting conversations and data. And create a central and clear role for participants within the research, and position them, importantly, as the experts within the interview. So I think photo elicitation interviews are really interesting because the dynamics are totally turned on their heads. The participant is kind of placed in the position of expert. They're showing you, they're telling you, and actually it's on an intellectual level, it's really fascinating. But when you're thinking about the ethics and trying to make non-hierarchical research relationships, you're shifting that hierarchy, and it really makes for quite insightful, informative, and really naturally flowing conversation. So I just wanted to give you some examples of photo elicitation, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, and a lot of these, if not all of these examples, do derive from the global north. So the one that I referenced earlier, Radley and Taylor's Images of Recovery, a photo elicitation study on the hospital ward, is really interesting. If I were to encourage you to only read one of those papers, that would be the one that I would say to go to. There's homeless veterans' experiences with substance use, recovery and treatment through photo elicitation, picturing masculinities using photo elicitation in men's health research, picturing global educational inclusion, looking and thinking across students' photographs from the UK, Zambia and Indonesia. If you were to do a search of photo elicitation research studies, more often than not, what comes up are these papers around, recovery on a hospital ward. A lot of studies have used them to document homelessness or substance addiction, substance misuse, and so on. So again, thinking about it as a tool for researching with and including the voices of often the voiceless. And I think, just on that question of a photo elicitation study of a hospital ward, it's one thing to ask a participant to recall their experience of being a hospital patient, but it's something quite different to actually visually see their experiences as they are captured in that one snapshot second. And again, that's another thing to kind of point out as well, just on a note of photo elicitation. Just as interviews or verbal representations and constructions from a particular subjective viewpoint, so too are images. Something has been photographed for a reason. It's been included for a reason. It's been shared with the researcher for a reason. These are snapshots. These are representations from subjective viewpoints. And that is what makes it all the more interesting. So just to give you an example, so I've spoken a little bit about my PhD. So my PhD was in ethnography of working class students at an elite UK university, a range of methods: conventional interviews, participant observation, photo elicitation, walking tours, driving tours, a whole host of methods. And I just wanted to include this as an example. I'm sure many of you aren't from an educational background, but I just wanted to kind of give you an insight into the rich data and verbal articulation that photo elicitation can yield. So this is just one photo that one of my participants, I'll use the pseudonym Daniel, took for my study. So I just asked the participants to take photos that documented or showed or represented their experience of being a working class student at Stella University. And when I looked at this photo, I thought, okay, perhaps he's stayed late or he's revising for an exam. That is as far as my understanding of as the photo went. But actually, when I asked Daniel, what's going on in this photo, something really different came out of that. And I'll just read the quote that's underneath the image below. So he tells me this room was just always empty every time I went in there. I sent this picture to my, I believe it's research partner, because he is always talking about me working hard. And I was like, me working hard early again. I took it to show that I was working when no one else was. I kind of like that feeling. I like to remind myself that I'm actually working hard, because sometimes when you think everything's a bit much, you think, could I be doing more? Sorry, I can't read all of the, some of the words are not on the screen, so I'm going to read it, and apologies if I don't read it word for word. Whenever I do my work, I always think I could have answered that better. It leaves me feeling like I won't have done very well. I've been doing all right, but I don't like to tell myself that because I'm worried I'll slip up. So when I looked at this photo, I saw, you know, working hard, perhaps revising for an exam, perhaps doing coursework, which on some levels, this is exactly what's depicting. But it goes beyond that. So Daniel is talking about the fact that he needs to remind himself that he's actually working hard, because sometimes he thinks, you know, could I be doing more? He always thinks that when he answers a question, he could have done a lot better, and it leaves him feeling like he won't have done very well. And importantly, in this last sentence, he speaks about the fact that, you know, even when he is doing well at work, when he is succeeding and getting the grades, he doesn't like to tell himself that he's doing well because he's worried that he'll slip up. And there's this conversation goes on, and there are other photos where Daniel is depicting the fact that he's working hard. And what comes out of this conversation is the fact that, you know, although he does achieve well at university, his experience is marked by insecurity that, you know, this is all by accident, it's a fluke, I'm not actually capable of achieving these grades, I'm not actually intelligent, it's just a matter of time before I'm found out, you know, I'm not meant to be here, this is just luck, and so on. So what it speaks to on another level is feelings of imposterism, that he doesn't belong. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that whilst I looked at this photo and saw perhaps nothing more than a jacket, an empty study room, and perhaps coursework or revision, for Daniel, this photo was trying to convey the fact that, you know, he needs to work all the time, because he feels like if he doesn't, he's not going to achieve. And even when he does achieve, it's not always guaranteed the next time. So just a nice example of the way in which photo elicitation can yield some really insightful information. And again, this point that he felt like he was working hard, but it can't be taken for granted, that never came up in one-on-one interviews, that never came up prior to the photo elicitation. So I'm just going to read some of the questions that have been coming in. So we have a question regarding the comment, photos that are not interesting, can this be elaborated? An abstract photo may not be interesting to look at until you're provided with the explanation, right? Maybe this is a subjective viewpoint. Yeah, so what my point of that is, for example, on photos on the surface might not seem interesting, but actually it's the intended meaning and what is trying to be conveyed underneath. As a sociologist and someone that's fascinated with creative methods, I am yet to come across a picture that I haven't found interesting, but I just wanted to put that out there. What on the surface might not seem interesting always is, and it's when we get that subjective explanation and articulation. And of course, what is considered interesting to one person might not be considered interesting to the next. So again, what we find interesting and fascinating is totally subjective. So thank you, Mario, for that really interesting point.
I think the point you just made there, Carly, about the picture you've put on the screen now, it just looks like a book. It looks like they're studying hard, but what you've done with photo elicitation is shown that what could be quite a boring picture actually has a lot of motivation and thoughts and emotions behind it. So it is a good way to kind of unpick a very normal picture to you, because it's actually something that means a lot to them. So I think when you spoke to that slide, I was like, actually that answers Mario's question very well. So hopefully, Mario, you got a lot out of this slide about what actually is an interesting photo and like what we mean by interesting. So the next comment, is from Muir Houston at University of Glasgow, who says he uses stock photographs of various contexts to elicit discussions. on poverty, homelessness. So maybe there's no personal connection to the photograph, but maybe someone can speak to the photograph and maybe put their own attitudes and own stories to a photo that hasn't been taken by themselves, which is another way for photo elicitation to work. And it shows that photographs can be imbued with lots of different meanings to lots of different people. So thank you very much for that comment here.
I'm just taking a moment to read through some of these questions that have come in. They're quite lengthy questions, so just bear with me. I'm not reading the newspaper. Just bear with me. Okay, so we have a question about, so far what I understand is the core of participatory research is to amplify the voice of the participants and active role in the research design. My questions are, all kinds of methods involve participation to some extent, and this may be secondary research. How to clearly suggest I'm doing participatory research, as it may be subject to the subjective understanding and justification of the researcher. What I'm taking away from that question is, you know, given that all research concerns participants, how do I explain and justify how I'm doing participatory research? I think just those two words, thinking about what those two words mean. What does it mean to be a participant, and what does it mean to do participatory research? I think it goes back to what I discussed at the beginning of this session. So involving participants in the co-creation of data. And what I mean by that is giving the participants some control and creative outlet for them to create data. So here, the creation of data, and I hate the word data on some levels, because to me, you know, this is not just data to be extracted, these are people's experiences. But what I mean by participatory research is that you're including participants in the co-creation of the research, whether it is co-creating the methods that are used, the questions that are asked, the data that is generated, or how that's represented. So a second question from the same respondent asks, you mentioned the photos are taken by the participants through their eyes and what they find important. Will they still be analysed by the researchers? This is up to the individual project. So in my project, I focused my analysis on the participants' explanation and articulation of the photographs. I did not look at the photograph and analyse it myself and write in what I understand the photo to mean. That was a decision that I made. There's no one correct decision. There may be reasons why participants analyse the photographs, and that's absolutely fine. I think it comes back to your research questions and what you want to find out. I'm not saying one method of analysis is more ethical or more valid or more thorough than others. I think that comes down to your project and what your research questions are. Okay, so
we have a question from Lavinia Hirsu at University of Glasgow, who asks, is there always a need to unpack the photographs and ask for their meaning? From a multimodal perspective, the visual mode may provide ways of constructing research which may not need to be exhaustive and analytical all the time. So again, Lavinia, I think that's a very, very good point. Like, is there a need to exhaustively dissect a photograph to each of its different points, or is there a narrative to be made about it? And again, I think, as Carli said before, participation exists on a spectrum, and the data we're gathering and how we analyse it also is dependent on the research questions we ask and what we and the participants want to talk about. So again, there isn't a right or wrong answer to that. I think your point is well made, and hopefully some people who are wanting to do photography may want to use it as maybe more of a kind of gallery where they're showing snapshots of their life and showing a kind of a wider narrative across pictures rather than individual pictures.
So there's a question, and apologies, the name is not written down here, but student from the University of Glasgow Clinical Psychology doctoral programme. So this student says, I'm interested in examples of creative research with asylum seekers and refugees reliant on interpreters for accessing healthcare. So there's a really interesting paper by Les Back at Goldsmiths, and forgive me, I cannot remember the year that it was published, but if you just have a Google and go on his publications, you'll be able to find it. And it is a really nice paper, a methodological paper reflecting on creative research and including participants as co-researchers on a project that is looking at, I believe, and I've read this ages ago, so this is vague, so apologies if I've misrepresented this, and I believe it's with participants who were asylum seekers or migrants. And the reason why creative research methods were needed over traditional interviews was because interviews represented something that was too formal and too much linked to the idea of surveillance. So as refugees, they had interacted a lot with government organisations, whether it was immigration services and so on, and they had to be formally interviewed in order to seek refuge and have their papers accepted. So in terms of interviews, it just wasn't suitable to use because it would, the participants of that project wouldn't open up because interviews were something as kind of, you know, I'm going to give as little information as possible, but also they represented and brought back in the emotions associated with past experiences of being interviewed with government officials and so on. So just on that line, these questions are really interesting, but we do have an hour left and we've got a lot to get through, so we're going to move this on. So I'm just going to speak really briefly about participatory film, and then move on to talk about go along and walking interviews, and then Jo will come in and give some examples from her PhD research. So participatory film can be used in a number of ways, and I'm going to play this video to you because I think it far better summarises the potential use of participatory film better than I can sort of say here. So basically this film was produced from researchers at the University of Bath, and it was looking at the research question, how fair is fair trade, ethical cocoa production and gender in Ghana. And I'm not going to say too much more, I'm just going to play this.
Sorry everyone, we're just checking that we can all get sound through this.
We had tested this prior to starting.
It was working.
The sound was working, but technology is exciting like this, so some on-the-spot troubleshooting. Thank you for your patience.
If we can't get it to work, it will be embedded in the slides that will be accessible after we finish up today, so it may be something you can watch in your own time if we can't get it to work.
Ghana, 22% of female-headed households grow cocoa, and 18% of female landholders have cocoa farms. In recent years, ethical consumption and production initiatives implemented under the Fair Trade umbrella have become increasingly significant in the export and marketing of agricultural products in sub-Saharan Africa. And this has also been the case with cocoa production in Ghana. Fair trade has been instrumental in empowering many Ghanaian cocoa farmers who are vulnerable to price fluctuations and the social and environmental problems exacerbated by conventional global markets. However, recent critiques have raised important questions about fair trade certification, about its impacts, and who it benefits in cocoa-producing communities. In July 2015, we undertook detailed research in 2 cocoa-producing regions in Ghana to explore the impact of fair trade cocoa production on the lives of women. As part of this process, a range of participatory research methods were adopted, which allowed women to express their different positions on the role of women in fair trade organizations and the obstacles they faced in being included in fair trade value chains. The main method of data collection and dissemination, participatory video, enabled the women involved in the research to use simple handheld video cameras to document their experiences of cocoa farming and to engage with other key stakeholders who had specialist knowledge about the fair trade cocoa production system. What I want to do is to show you how to use the camera. So yes, the first thing you do is you have your camera open. Yes, the button to turn the camera on is found here. So this is the first thing we do. Push the button to turn the camera on. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, good. Now, the trick is to hold, you're holding the camera the right way. The trick is to try and keep the camera straight. And what you see inside the screen is what you will see in the film itself. Okay? Yes. So, if you want to record something, this is the button to record. So try. You're filming it. Try filming something. Yeah. This is the speaker in the front. It's picking up all the sound. So when you're actually doing the filming, you have to be careful of the sounds in the background.
Okay, so that was just one example of the use of participatory film, and I'm not going to get too much into the theoretical underpinnings of the use of participatory film as a research method, because much of it, there's many kind of similarities between the theoretical underpinnings of participatory film and photo elicitation, as you might imagine. But I'm just going to read this extract from the bottom of the screen, written by the researchers reflecting on the use of participatory film in their research exploring ethical cocoa production and gender in Ghana. So they write that the film that we have made explores gender and fair trade through a video material captured by me as the researcher, not me, but the actual researcher, but also through the video shot by the research participants themselves. And the researcher, Dr. Roy, goes on to say that the fact that the research is shot by the research participants themselves is the most powerful element of the film. The use of participatory video allows the women farmers in the film to tell their stories themselves, and in the process offers a much more nuanced picture of the gendered impacts of fair trade. So something just as simple as handing over a handheld video camera, which in today's technological era can be purchased for a relatively small fee, has the power to kind of, not only allow the women to tell their stories themselves, which historically stories of the powerless have always been told by the powerful, but in doing so, we really get a more nuanced picture. and as well as the fact that this visual representation has implications for the potential dissemination of research, and when as researchers we're trying to make an impact perhaps on policy, on practice, and on business, and perhaps on consumer behaviour as well. So that's just one example of the way in which participatory film, and it's often starts with this idea, you know, document your experiences of ... whatever the research project might be looking at. And I think the thing to remember with photo elicitation and participatory film, not everything will speak to answering your research questions, and that is absolutely fine. Perhaps for 10 minutes of footage, you might have 2 minutes that are kind of research gold in that they directly speak to your research questions. For every 10 photos, you might get 2 that elicit really, really insightful, useful information that answer your research questions. And that's absolutely fine. That's part and parcel of what it means to be doing participatory and creative research. You're handing power arguably over to the respondents, and with that, they can take it in any direction that they choose. So that's really important to consider. But I hope that this is just one example of the role of participatory film. And there are many other examples out there, but I hope that gives you an idea. So I'm going to speak briefly about go along or walking interviews in the next 3 slides, and then I'm going to hand over to Jo, who's going to talk through some examples of go along from her PhD, and then she'll speak about mapping, which is an excellent creative method. Okay, so the go along or the walking interview, what are they? How do we do them? Beyond walking, obviously. So the go along or walking interview is a mobile method, and it's where we simply interview participants walking through environments. So I might be concerned with how, let's use the example of women again, apologies, the gendered experiences of experiencing areas of urban Delhi, for example. So we might go on a walking interview, and this is because we want to encourage the interaction between the participant with their social spatial environment. We might also do a go along walking interview with students on their journeys to school in, let's just say, in Johannesburg in South Africa, in order to kind of understand the logistical barriers of getting to school. So the go along walking interview rests on this interaction between the participant and their social spatial environment. It seeks to mimic daily behaviour and routine, although it doesn't always have to. You might do a walk along interview where a participant is showing you around their neighbourhood or around their university, and that might not actually be part of their daily routine, and that's fine. But importantly, we're looking at how participants socially construct knowledge, and how they socially construct knowledge in relation to their built or rural social spatial environment. And again, it encourages co-production if the participant chooses the route. So this is something to consider as well when you're doing go along or walking interviews. Are you, the researcher, going to be asked, can you take me to X, Y, Z? Or are you going to totally hand it over to your participant? Are they going to be in control of the route that they take? And similarly, are they going to decide the route that they're going to walk you around on the spot, in the field, or are they going to pre-plan that? So just thinking about the neighbourhood as one example of the way in which and where you can conduct walking interviews, but you might also do a walking interview within the workplace, you know, moving around a hospital, etc., or walking around a school is another example. But in this case, I'm going to discuss using the neighbourhood to do walking interviews. So the neighbourhood can be used as a series of interview prompts. And here the interviewer can become the interested outsider. And present day and memories of the neighbourhood can be elicited. So again, some similarities with photo elicitation. This idea that moving through these spaces and places can kind of elicit memories and also issues and instances that are very present in the everyday that perhaps wouldn't be elicited in a normal conventional one-on-one interview or focus group. So the walk-in interview can be semi-structured in nature, but also it reacts to naturally occurring events. And what I mean by that is that you might choose to go, as a researcher, you might choose to participate in a go-along and walking interview with a set of broad questions that you want to ask and broad themes that you want to cover. But at the same time, the beauty of go-along and walking interviews is the fact that you just allow for the social interaction between the participant and the neighbourhood to direct what is going to be discussed and what is elicited. So you're using walking through a setting as really your stimulus for the discussion and as prompts and as probes, in a way that you would have probes and prompts in a normal interview with your interview guide. So you're letting the neighbourhood and the environment that you're walking through, in a way, essentially being the interview guide. Can you tell me about this? Can you tell me about that? The participant may, by walking a particular route, think of, oh, and this and that, and so on. And that's the beauty of the creative method of walking interviews. So when we're thinking about walking interviews, some of the theoretical underpinnings derive from this understanding that spaces and places are constructed given their material construction, and they're also interpreted, perceived, imagined, understood and felt. And again, this is kind of the point of walking interviews, like photo elicitation, really can elicit a different kind of information. So as we move through spaces and places, we don't move through them as a kind of a detached individual, but these spaces and places elicit feelings and emotions, good and bad, happy memories, perhaps present day fears. And it is in this way that walking interviews, as well as the kind of issue of just occupying and moving through spaces and places, is a multi-sensorial experience. And it's in that way that what you get verbally through walking interviews versus perhaps traditional one-on-one interviews is kind of placing the sensory experience at the heart of your narrative. And that's something that is a core benefit of thinking about, you know, why might we use walking interviews? And just thinking about participant-led walking and driving tours, and I'll speak about driving tours in a second, they provide insight into the lives of participants where it would otherwise be too intrusive to develop long-term encounters. So again, you know, speaking about this idea of you want to understand life within a neighbourhood, to use an example from my own current research, how do we do that in a way where we're not going to be too intrusive and too disruptive? As an outsider, is it ethical to embed yourself within a neighbourhood? I won't get into those discussions. Perhaps for many ways it is, perhaps for many ways it isn't. But this is a nice way of understanding in a small part neighbourhoods and environments and built spaces and places that, you know, would otherwise take quite a long term to get to grips and understand. And just with walking tours, I'll come back to that in a second, but just with walking tours and driving tours, it's this, they're quite similar in their theoretical underpinnings. So just as a walking tour, a participant would walk you around a space and place. A driving tour would be quite similar in the, you know, the researcher might be the driver, or the participant might be the driver, or you may have a driver and you'll drive round a place, and this might be, you might drive around, I don't know, central London at night, observing the nighttime economy, etc. And thinking about that. That's just one example off the top of my head, perhaps not the best. But we're really thinking about the way in which people and place combine. In participant-led and walking and driving tours, it gave access from my own PhD to some of the transcendent and reflective aspects of lived experience. So when we're just transcending through and moving through, what does that experience? But again, and this is just kind of picking up on some of the ethical implications of doing these types of interviews, we need to think about what is termed the micro-politics of the field interactions. So when we talk about field interactions and ethics is not something you just do as a one-time event when you're filling out your ethics form, but it's something that you deeply consider throughout your research. and thinking about the small, tiny decisions that actually speak to the politics of doing research and the ethical implications of doing research. And I've touched on this in the previous slides. Just thinking about predetermining routes. So whilst predetermining routes might be expected to lessen the empowerment felt by interviewees, actually by choosing their own routes, that's up to them if they want to choose their own routes. But one argument against it is this idea that predetermining routes might be expected to lessen the empowerment felt by interviewees choosing their own routes, which may in turn detract from the informality of the encounter. This is one perspective, but it's one that kind of advocates for a really informal walking or driving tour. But you know, there might not always be instances where you can't predetermine where not predetermining your route is not appropriate for whatever reason. When you're thinking about conducting your research, you need to think about the importance of context and safety. So if you are researching, I don't know, a neighbourhood, you might need to consider places where you can go and where you can't go, and then that to some extent might feed into the extent to which you do predetermine your route or not. So again, these are no hard and fast rules as about what's right or wrong, but again, just giving you some theoretical underpinnings as to some of the literature that's out there. And importantly, and I think this is really lovely, the environment, whether you're doing a walking or driving tour, the environment becomes the third participant in the research setting. So participants and interviewers can comment on what they pass, memories and emotions can be ascribed to sights and smells. So just to give you some of the examples. And again, when thinking of driving interviews in particular, because I haven't really spoken at length about that, you need to consider you know, again, what is your research question? Why are you doing driving interviews? So just to give you an example, Kirsty Finn in the Department of Education here at Glasgow, she's done some lovely research on local students and their commute to university, and she used the method of driving interviews but also commuting interviews, so perhaps going along and with participants as they commute to university through local transportation and their own driving in their own cars, and that brings up some lovely data. But again, the use of walking and driving interviews, you need to bring it back to your research question. What is it that you want to explore and find out? Okay, if you do have any questions on walking and driving interviews, pop them down and we will do our best to select some and answer them. I'm going to pass over to Jo now, who's going to talk about go-along interviews.
So during my PhD, which was 2010 to 2014, I conducted a PhD looking at young people's experiences of urban regeneration. So that's policies that look to change the urban environment either through demolition or recladding or rebuilding of homes, often in deprived areas. In the policy setting, young people are very rarely consulted with and very rarely taken into account as active citizens. So my PhD looked at ways to engage with them regarding policy changes in their area. So the go along took about 20 minutes, going from their home in a high-rise flat. It was planned to be demolished in the next few years. And we walked around passing by shops that had recently closed down because the population in the neighbourhood had diminished to the point that it was no longer economically sound for a shop to continue in that area. We passed by demolition sites. That's the first photograph you can see there, that used to contain homes that their grands, aunts and school friends used to go to. So when we passed them, we spoke a lot about how the routine changed. Like they used to maybe use that flat to hang out with their friends at night, or they would pass by it on the way to school, or they would go there after school to eat dinner at their grand's house. And it's how these urban policies were affecting their everyday life. Also, going around some of the demolition sites, we also spoke a lot about safety. So while it used to be a safe space, now with an increase in derelict land, there was worries about who else was using the space, with worries about dangerous adults, people taking drugs and alcohol that may pose a risk to especially young women in that area. By using go-alongs as well, we also spoke about the future, like what would you want to see in that space? What would you like to participate in? What would you like to see as an adult? Would you stay in that area? So again, it's just a way to unpick the environment as we went around it. Because I think if we sat in their homes and spoke about urban regeneration and about demolition processes, we maybe wouldn't get their autobiographical connections to the environment in such a way. The second example is not from my PhD, but from a colleague, Claire Binner, in Urban Studies at Glasgow University, who used go-alongs and photo elicitation to look at residents' experiences in super diverse neighbourhoods in Glasgow. What she found was using the same route with different populations, so one with policymakers, one with migrant groups, one with kind of white middle class residents in the area. Using the same route gave very different reflections on how space and services were used, and actually shown that in some cases, these groups, while living in the same geographic location, didn't have any opportunities to interact. So she was able to utilise this to kind of discuss with policy that while we are developing super diverse neighbourhoods, actually the kind of community cohesion elements were still very much lacking. Okay, so going on to something that can be used very much in even planning a go-along interview is mapping. So it's another participatory method that seeks to utilise and problematise space. It's useful for investigating socio-spatial experiences and local scales, and can also be seen to connect local and global issues. It's often useful to use mapping to access information that may be difficult to obtain using traditional methods, as with photo elicitation, with go-alongs and with driving interviews. And it's how we recognise our neighbourhoods, give meaning to place, and how we connect people and places together. It's also useful in locations where maybe go-alongs or drive-alongs may not be safe for people to use, or places where there's maybe issues with the kind of pedestrianisation of an area. So we can use mapping as a way to allow that communication about space, about networks, without having to actually walk in areas where participants may not feel safe to do so. So there are two main ways to conduct a mapping interview. Lee and Abbott in 2009 gave participants blank pieces of paper and asked people to draw a kind of cognitive map of their favourite places, which was conducted after a semi-structured interview. So perhaps your participant may have a blank sheet of paper and you start by asking, draw your own home. And then from that, indicate on this map how long it would take you to go to a bus stop. Where is your local services? So like together with the participant, you might collaborate to develop a map, or you may give them one question like draw your neighbourhoods, and they draw it themselves without much prompt to you. Again, it does depend on how you want to use that method. Travlau et al. In 2008 used place mapping, which used existing maps to inscribe their own experiences onto. So for them, they used a kind of aerial map of Edinburgh, and they asked different groups of teenagers from different socioeconomic groups or different groups within a school. So maybe they would ask children that may see themselves as more like alternative or goth, and maybe kids that see themselves more as like kind of sports teams. And how do you use space at the weekend? Like where are your social areas? What places don't you think you can go to because of X, Y, and Z? So again, it's just about kind of creating those dialogues with space, creating those dialogues that maybe they see as normal, and being able to unpick that and have the environment as that kind of third person in their interview. And with mapping, you can also see how others influence their own spatial behaviour. So the next slide is actually an example from a Lee and Abbott mapping exercise. So what's interesting here is you can see there are arrows in some of the places, and that's actually part of their routine. This is the kind of flow of their everyday life. So that's again a useful thing. So you can have landmarks and you can have pathways, but then you can also, through discussions, actually ask, well, how do you get from A to B, like, and how and when do you do this? So you can kind of have this more temporal attitude towards your map as well. This isn't just a snapshot. You can actually start reflecting on when would this map be most useful for you, when wouldn't it be?
Okay, so we have some really interesting questions that are coming from the audience, so I'll just go through them. So Rona Brown at the University of Glasgow asks a really important point. She writes, if the participant is filming or taking photographs, how do you handle the informed consent for the people who feature in what they produce? So I'm just going to take this and give an example. If you are taking photos outside in public spaces, I think the question is always about how are these photos going to be used. So in my own PhD, I actually asked participants, you know, I said, whilst they can take pictures of people, they need to ask for permission if this is okay. And then if they did, the participants' identities would be blurred. Interestingly, 9 times out of 10, the photos were more abstract than actually taking pictures of people. But inevitably, people are included in photographs, and I think it's always a question of ask for permission where possible. But typically, the literature states that if you're out in a public space, you know, as long as you're not taking pictures of somebody intentionally and there are people in the backdrop, then that's okay. And where the ethics of that does come into play is in how you use the photos for research purposes. So if you are going to disseminate photos, it might be suitable for you to kind of pixelate people's faces and so on. And also, I didn't touch on this, but I think it's important to think about when you're reproducing images for research dissemination, you know, what are you portraying in terms of are you perpetuating stereotypes about space and place, people and countries, or are you portraying the nuances and so on? So Jo, do you have any comment about ethics and informed consent in filming and taking photographs?
During my PhD, I used photo elicitation interviews as well. I asked the participants if you wanted to take pictures of family members to give a kind of sheet to the family members saying, like, I'm going to be using a photograph. Are you happy for me to use your image? This is going to be used by a researcher at the University of Glasgow. So again, it's about informed consent. As Carli says, if it is a member of the public that just happens to be passing by when you're taking a kind of shot of a street or shot of a location, then it can be a case of being able to blur. In an example, so I'm going to have to skip back a few slides here. In my example from the go along, on the top right, we see the top of a girl's head. That was one of my participants who took a lot of selfies. There was a lot of selfies on her roll of camera shots. And we took the decision that as an under 18, I don't know if I was able to publish them, but what I did do, rather than blur her face or kind of blur out her eyes, which in kind of youth studies, there is a kind of criminality element to, like, when you blur out a child's face, it's usually because of maybe a criminality issue. So instead we used shots that naturally did obscure a face, so the kind of the side of a head that's covered by hair, or the back of a head, or something that's kind of naturally blurred. So it's still using their photographs and using them in a very natural way and not doctoring them. But again, being able to protect the identity of a participant that maybe at 11 would be happy for me to share their image, but maybe at 19, they're like, actually, I no longer want that to be shared anymore, which is always an issue for kind of visual methods researchers, and one that participants may be able to come back to you if you give them contact details and say, I've thought about it, after a few years, I no longer want that to be part of your project. And it's up to us as researchers to accept those wishes and take off any image that doesn't want to be shared anymore, especially after the GDPR changes. And just on that point, in terms of informed consent in using images, etc., within my own PhD, on my informed consent form, I asked participants, you know, I had a list of, are you okay for me to use this as data in my PhD, tick or cross? Are you okay for me to use these images as teaching materials, tick or cross? Are you okay for me to use these images in published journal articles and in conference presentations? So there were multiple levels of informed consent there.
And I do have a picture, which I didn't include in this session, that a student had taken of sitting at the back of a lecture theatre of, you know, the board. And it wasn't to show everyone in the image, it was to show, I don't understand what's going on. And I was like, this is so insightful, this is so interesting, but can I use it given that so many people were included? And in conversation with my supervisors at the time, we decided that because nobody's identity was shown, it was taken from the back of the room, so it was people's backs of head. The lecturer was just the outline, so you couldn't see the identity, you couldn't identify the institution or even the subject matter. We decided that it would be okay for inclusion in my PhD. So I think that we need to think of informed consent as a multi-layered process, but there is obviously there's an added element when you're doing research in public places and spaces. Yeah, so I think there's no one correct answer, but you need to think about the different elements of that. I've just got some questions, and because of time, I'm just going to run through these a little bit quickly. Some questions around the extent to which we should know the neighbourhood dynamics, questions around how long should semi-structured interviews go on for, and how do we record and capture this data. So in terms about understanding the neighbourhood dynamics, well, this is really up to you as a researcher. If you go in with too many predetermined, perhaps, understandings of what you are going to expect in terms of the neighbourhood, how will that detract you from listening to and understanding what the participant has to say? So again, it's that question of when we do research, we'll obviously in the back of our mind have what we might expect to find from the literature that we've read, but at the same time we want to stay away from that because we don't want that to direct us into narrowly focusing on, you know, this instead of this. And I think that in terms of thinking about what knowledge you want to know prior to going into these neighbourhoods, that's a question of you and what you think might be most useful. In terms of the nature and length of the semi-structured interview, and how can you prepare interview instruments, it's up to you. So for me, and a lot of the literature is based on the premise that walking interviews are very sociable, occur in the moment, and very kind of like grounded in kind of more, I don't want to say more natural, because at the end of the day it is still an artificial context, but perhaps at least feel somewhat more natural than a one-on-one interview. So for me, at the back of my mind, I kind of had questions that I thought I would ask, but at the same time, it's you can only prepare so much. But I don't know how you found this, Jo, but yeah, I found that I could only prepare so much, and it really depended on, you know, what came out in the moment, and that's fine. These are, to some extent, bottom-up research methods of data collection, and no two interviews will be the same, and that's fine. Just in terms of how can we collect data and information, so you might video the walking interview, although I didn't do that, I just voice recorded it on a voice recorder, but you might want to give the participant the video and record it, have the participant record you know, the environment that you're walking through. I haven't tried that, but I wonder how much actually videoing something would detract from actually experiencing it in a more natural way. I don't know if you have any comments on that. But yeah, you can either choose to visually record it or record it on a dictaphone. And then again, you type up the verbatim what's said between and focus your analysis on that, or you can focus your analysis on also the sensory experience and so on. Okay, and just this third question, just really importantly, that I think is nice to address. So the environment becomes the third participant, but don't you think that a participant can respond to the same set of environments differently based on their mood and perception, thereby posing a problem for increasing variables for a single problem? I think that's absolutely an interesting point to make. But I think that whilst a respondent can respond to their environment depending on their mood, the same can be said of other methods of data collection. So in an interview, I can you know, an interview with a participant that's energised and happy that day is going to go very different to if they're a bit fatigued and thinking about what they've got to cook for dinner or what they've got to do for childcare, etc. So I don't think that that is unique to the method of walking interviews or photo elicitation, but I think that that's something that's always there. And I think it's important to remember that, you know, a lot of the participatory and creative research methods are grounded in the notion that there does not exist one reality and there are multiple versions of realities. And again, it views interviews, photo elicitation, walking tours as, you know, whilst we try to make them naturalistic, at the end of the day, they are constructions of an experience, emotions and perceptions, and that's fine. We acknowledge that, and that's absolutely fine. Okay, so one last thing, sorry. One of the questions is about how we prepare for walking interviews if the routes are determined by participants. One of the main things to do when you're doing that, if it is going to be determined by the participant, is to make sure the participant uses a route that they feel safe walking down. And if there's any place they don't want to walk down, they don't have to do it just to show us something. They can talk about it later on. In my PhD, there was an area where a lot of gang fighting happened and a lot of kind of territorial issues. And one of the participants is like, I'd like to show you that, but I'm worried that as like a kind of young man, that might be seen as me like trying to start something. So I was like, well, we don't have to do that. This is your route and we need to keep you safe. So when we got back to his house, we spoke about that a little bit more, but we didn't have to walk there. So again, it's important that in any of these methods, to make sure that participant safety is at the kind of forefront of your mind. So the next few slides, we're going to talk about mixing methods. So the first one I'm going to speak about was using mapping and walking interviews to explore memories of place for those who migrated from the north of Ghana to the capital, Accra, in slum settlements, but who had still had family in the north. And they tried to compare that with those who stayed and didn't actually migrate. The study looked at the impact of climate change in those decisions and also the impact of migration on social networks, looking at issues of social isolation, like looking at what happens like when families are separated by a large geographic distance. The authors found that climate change debates in literature are framed around earth science processes and economic measures, and that they fail to recognise the experienced worlds of individuals and communities that are bound up in local places, and where the physical changes of the environment will have profound cultural and symbolic impacts. And that was a quote by Agdar et al. In 2009. So the authors said that particularly marginalised groups for poor and vulnerable populations have a lived experience of climate change that are largely unnoticed by policymakers. And this is particularly profound in the global south. So for them, they were interested in kind of emancipatory, participatory, community engagement approaches to try and shine a light on these experiences that are often undiscussed at the kind of wider, like macro level policy making discussions. So again, they used mapping. So for them, they used the kind of blank sheet of paper approach. They asked people to draw a basic map of their village with a few landmarks. They then used stickers to indicate small and large changes. Different colours of stickers represented good and bad changes. They were able to identify places that triggered negative emotions and therefore were likely to be avoided due to fear, pain, anger and sadness. These changes may be something through environmental change, social change and economic change. And during the mapping exercise, they were able to discuss the motivations for these placement of stickers and to kind of develop a better understanding of their biographical maps. They then used walking interviews, and that again followed the mapping activity to explore in more depth and through lived experiences the most important environmental and social changes as perceived by each of the participants. Explored in more depth the important environmental and social changes. So they may walk past a home, they may walk past a piece of land, and then just discuss like, how has this changed over time? How have you experienced this change? For those that left the neighbourhoods to move to the cities and come back, since you left and came back, has there been a change? Like what's happened that you have noticed as someone that's maybe now more of an outsider to the village that you grew up in?
The results, the authors reflected that these methods were able to better understand everyday sights and behaviours. One quote was, "At the dam," where one of the participants directed them during the walking interview, the respondent expressed sorrow that because of all the impurities from the town and the erosion that all washes into the dam, it made the drinking water unsafe and unhygienic for human health. So again, this was a service that could no longer be used and something that they had seen change in their own lifetime due to issues of climate change and issues of kind of massive expansion of cities. Another quote was from a participant who said, "There used to be a big neem tree behind my house that had recently been cut to build a house. I was very angry at this because they cut it without asking and did not apologise. I had then planted a tree to replace the cut one, but I am disappointed about these changes to the environment. I always see these areas because I pass them on the way to the farm." So again, it's this ability to then look at kind of macro level changes and how it impacts the individual. And again, how this individual can interact with these changes, both emotionally and also with their own actions to try and kind of push back against the change that they don't feel happy with. Another example used photography, walking interviews and focus groups to explore the lived experience of social participation in older adults in Singapore. The study was part of a wider community assessment to inform the development and evaluation of a community intervention in an elder-friendly neighbourhood in a Singaporean housing estate. The authors aimed to give older people a voice in solving community issues that affected them, and aimed to set up elder-led interest groups that look to promote greater social participation through older people. So again, we see this, So again, we see this issue of community engagement, this idea of empowering participants, this idea that the participants can lead the research, can lead what's going to happen at the end of it, and there's going to be kind of a promotion of participation. This isn't just going to be participation for the sake of getting a publication. This is seeking to change the kind of social world of these older people living in a community and housing estate. So how did they use these methods? Polaroid cameras were given out, with participants offered training in photography and the ethics around photo taking, which we've kind of briefly touched on in this seminar. Participants were given a 1-month period to take the photographs, and then in this month they were encouraged to go around their community and photo document 50 photographs relating to the lives of elders in their community. They were also given a photo journal to organise their images, maybe with captions underneath each one, so when it comes back after the month, they're able to reflect on what the image was and the reasons behind the photograph being taken. Similar to one of the comments we had from our audience, the photographs were then used as prompts for a focus group, so the authors didn't just look at who took the photo and the meaning that they ascribed to the photo. They also used it in a focus group setting, like using it as a focus group prompt. So this is a photograph. What do we think is being shown here? How do your personal and social attitudes influence how you see this photograph, and what are the kind of narratives that we can develop through this? They also used walking interviews for the interviewed experts from the area. So this is interesting. So one method used one participant group, another method used another, and then they were able to kind of compare and contrast how each group could see the same neighbourhood. So the experts worked with older adults and asked questions relating to how culture and retirement context influence social participation of older adults, and how those practitioners used outreach work and built rapport with older people. The results of this paper showed the creative methods used reflected social patterning of lifestyle and actually uncovered a lot of social isolation amongst older people. So through photography, they found that ethnicity was an organising structure for a lot of the activities within the elder supported housing group. For example, kind of cultural or religious celebrations were done not across communities but within communities. Also in the kind of photography session, participants photo documented the lives of older adults who had fallen on hard times and lived outside the socially accepted norms of their community, having to earn a living through asking for alms or odd jobs. As we walked through the poorer rental flat precincts, the community volunteers reflected on their experiences of the same group. So in one group, the older people photographed them, and in the other group, the experts walked through these neighbourhoods. So again, it's an issue that both populations were able to speak to. As we walked through the poorer rental precincts, community volunteers shared that living this way was largely because they faced financial difficulties and had become estranged from their family. It faced barriers in accessing subsidies entitled to lower income adults. So again, it's a nice method to look at those that maybe had been disempowered in society to kind of show their stories in living in this society. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes, and in that 10 minutes, we're going to talk you through, can't speak correctly, some of the ethics of creative methods, and briefly touch on some things that you need to consider during the analysis of these methods. And I think the first thing that I want to say is that this is not by no means a comprehensive list of all the ethical issues that you need to consider, nor all of the things to consider when analysing, but just some of the core things that we thought would be interesting to discuss with you today. So again, whilst participatory methods might enable the voice of the participant to be heard, and this is great, it doesn't mean that, you know, your ethics stop there. There is still a lot of ethical considerations to keep in mind. And as Rona brought up in her question, you know, the issue of keeping people and participants anonymous and confidential, these are serious issues that we've briefly touched upon earlier. So Prostar has written, participants may explicitly and voluntarily waive their rights to confidentiality and anonymity, getting tongue-tied, contravening one of the cornerstones of normative ethical practices in social science research. So it's this idea that, you know, we always keep participants anonymous. But what do we do when participants want to waive their right to be kept anonymous? They want to kind of take ownership over the fact that they're produced these images. You know, that raises ethical dilemmas, in particularly in how we represent the research. And importantly, how can we conduct research in keeping with the pillars of ethical social science? I've also included a link to a really nice YouTube video with Professor Sarah Pink, who's based in Australia, a big writer on visual and sensory ethnography, and that video just summarises some of the opportunities, challenges and ethics. So because of time, I thought that I'd include that link there rather than trying to go through everything myself. So I think just one of the things to think about with ethics of creative methods is how we represent people and places, and how do we keep people anonymous and in information confidential, and also thinking about what are we representing when we reproduce these photos. Are we perpetuating negative stereotypes about people and places, countries and continents, or are we actively challenging them? So just always thinking about, you know, what, beyond our intention of including and disseminating that research, what are the kind of other effects of doing so? Okay, so the question then hangs over creative methods. Is the quality of the data better because of the nuance that we have experienced designing it? And how can we translate our experience into the written reports? Creative research methods suggest that it enables researchers to acknowledge a reality that may not be easily accessible through traditional interviews, as we're better able to maybe access the social construction of knowledge, the presentation of identity and biography. But how can we document this nuance into traditional dissertation, thesis or journal articles? How can we code photo elicitation images? How can we code interactions with the environment through go-alongs? And how can we code maps? So I think often when we're trained as social researchers, we're trained to analyse text. As much as our methods are able to expand and explore with creativity, often we don't have the dialogue and vocabulary to code images in the same way, in the same confidence. So while we can't actually give an answer to these questions, because we ourselves are learning as we go along as well, there are things to consider during analysis. So for example, in photo elicitation, what was the intention of the photographer? Why did they take that image? What is seen and not seen in the image? Would this scene be different at different times of the day, or if a different group photographed it? And what's the relationship between the photographer and the subject of the image? During go-alongs, we can use field notes that we took on the day to document the sensory experience that may not be picked up in recordings, especially for audio recording it. We can also ask, where didn't we go? Why didn't we go there? And what does the route they chose tell you about their relationship with the environment? The analysing of the text and the recordings can be similar to other interviews, but then we can use the field notes to enrich the experience of analysis and writing up where appropriate. In terms of mapping, I'd also suggest maybe recording the mapping exercise. So we'd also have a kind of a narrative of like why each element is on the map, and then we can also analyse the map as an image in itself. Okay, so in conclusions, creative research methods offer the ability for participants to create and co-create the research agenda, but researchers do need to be open to this. If you have a set idea of your research, you have to ask why you want to use creative research methods. Are you just doing it because it's fun and you don't actually want to relinquish any of that control that maybe we're used to as researchers? It opens up questions of power in the research relationship. Who controls the question, who controls the meaning, and who controls the analysis? Are we able to share that with anyone, or do we just want to hold on to that power? Due to the nuance collected in these kind of methods, it's important to think about how we can retain this when it comes to our writing. It's not enough that we experience the nuance, but how can we share that with the audience? Otherwise, what was the point of doing this method anyway? And also the context of research, is it appropriate? And how can we better improve this? So it also all leads to the first question we asked, why are we using this method? Is it appropriate for your research question? I think we're going to finish up with some questions.
So I've just reviewing some of the questions that have come in, and I've just extracted something that I think's coming through in some of the questions. There's a lot about how do we prepare the interview instruments, talking about how the methods avoid the biasness to extract and analyse the information, especially in the walking interview. Some questions around, you know, if we ask the participant to video record of the walking interviews, can this influence the naturality of the outcome of the video, which eventually changes the meaning making? And I think it's important to think about this idea of biases and preparing the interviews. And I think that this is something that speaks across photo elicitation and walking and driving interviews, and potentially the mapping as well. I think that the creative and participatory methods are rooted in a methodological perspective that sees all types of research as biased in one way or another. It argues against objectivity, so feminism, so feminist research methods, the interpretive paradigm understands that there is no such thing as objective research, and no research can be totally free from bias. So I think that that's the first thing that we need to consider when we're adopting these methods. And actually bias is not bad, as long as you're aware of that, you acknowledge that, and you make that explicit throughout your research and your research write-up. And also, just on that note, a lot of these methods are concerned with researching and exploring the subjective individual experiences. So that is something that the research methods actively kind of embrace, if you will. And when we're thinking about if we're going to video record the interview and the effect to which video record the walking into, an effect to which that might influence or detract from the more natural feeling of just kind of being present in the moment. I think that's really important to consider. And in some ways it might work to shut down the conversation between the researcher, the participant, and the space and place that you're moving beyond. In some ways it might open it up. I think it really depends on the individual participant, and whether, you know, they might see the video recorder as, you know, they're empowered by it and showing, etc. Like the women in the Ghana study, or it might be this kind of inconvenience. And I think sometimes with these methods, it's always a little bit about experimenting and being comfortable about being in the field with a loose kind of understanding of how you think this may go, but just kind of not worrying too much about your interview guide. Like, chuck that out the window and just be free to immerse yourself in what is going on in the moment and to go with that. And no two walk-in interviews will be the same, and that's absolutely fine. You might not even ask the same questions or perhaps discuss the same points. That's fine.
The last question came actually quite at the start. Vanessa Fortune, University of Greenwich, can provide an example of creative methods used with quantitative methods. So the best examples of that are in Helen Cara's Creative Methods book, which is Creative Research Methods in the Social Sciences. She gives some very good examples of people who do use quantitative methods with creative methods. And one of the examples she uses is Dana Timina, who has a TED Talk and a talk on NCRM UK website, which is a research methods website, which looks at her experiences of being a mathematician researching hyperbolic geometry, and how she actually used crochet to try and develop a better understanding of how this kind of naturally occurring geometry exists and is created. So it's a lovely talk, and it's quite interesting for people that maybe even can't crochet. It's like a nice 10 minutes to really understand like how quite a hard science can also embrace kind of an arts-based approach as well. So hopefully you'll find either the book or the YouTube video interesting for understanding how these two things can mix.
Okay. And to just bring this session to an end, just to point in the direction of some very, very selected and limited, by no means comprehensive list of some of the resources and references from today's session. Finally, we just wanted to thank you all for your active participation, because without your questions, this session would have been a lot less richer discussion-wise. So thank you so much for your interesting questions and input. We hope that today's been useful. Again, this was just kind of dipping your toes into the water of some of the potentials of creative and participatory research. There's lots more out there, and we do encourage you to explore the various methods and be okay with feeling a bit nervous and a bit uneasy and experimenting. That's the exciting thing about these methods. Not everything always goes to plan, and that's fine. And in some instances, and most instances, that can be actually really great. So thank you.
It's all data. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.